you had also attempted doing a whole food plant-based diet, which is, in my opinion, the sort of like cleanest of the clean diets, right? So explain to me how you basically went from eating a not so clean diet to now a much cleaner diet. At what point did you try a whole food plant-based diet and why?
Well, that wasn't until actually pretty recently. So my whole trajectory at that point was I started my first little Facebook group in 2015 after I'd lost my weight. It was August of 2015. And I just wanted to have a place to talk about intermittent fasting in a safe place because, Facebook can be crazy with just me and my friends who were doing it. Because at that point, people were asking me about it. So I just started that group and we were just talking about intermittent fasting. Well, then the diet wars started happening. Do you remember all the diet wars? They're still going on. But at that time, people were like, you should be keto, you should be this, you should be that. And people were really not very nice about food choices. So as a part of wanting to understand, how do you help all these people that my groups grew and grew until eventually we had almost 500,000 people combined in these groups. But as people started to wandering in from all over that were interested in intermittent fasting, why are, some people doing keto and some people are plant-based and some people are standard American diet? What is really the best way of eating? And, I started learning about the blue zones. Gut health was starting to be talked about. This was 2017. And, I'd found Tim Spector's work by that point. I participated in the American Gut Project where they tested my gut microbiome. And I was starting to connect the dots about plants, plants being so healthy with both the blue zones and our gut microbiome and why. So I started eating a lot more plants in my diet at that point. And so I never made the decision I'm going to be a vegetarian, and I'm not a vegetarian. But over time, the more plants I added in, starting in 2017, the better I felt. Like the more beans I eat, the more satisfied I feel. Fiber, plant foods. So I started to realize if I had a big steak, it set in my stomach and it didn't feel good. So I don't want to go to a restaurant and have a big steak. I want to see what they have. They have a beet salad. I'm going to get that instead. What vegetables do they have? I'll just order a whole meal based on side dishes. So over the time, my eating really changed. I went through the Zoe study, or the Zoe program. The first time I went through it was probably 2019, probably right before I read Mastering Diabetes. And I was just adding more plants. And when I first read Mastering Diabetes the first time, I was not ready to hear about fat.
Oh, you were not ready to hear about the low fat approach
No.
for maximizing insulin sensitivity. Okay.
Absolutely
Why?
not. I was mad.
You're mad at what?
I was mad that was true. If that was true, I did not want to hear it because look, I'm a Scottish lassie in heritage. And my family, my DNA analysis showed that I'm lactase persistent. I'm one of the 25% of the population that's lactase persistent. Darn it, don't take away my butter and my dairy. And I love it. So I was mad. And my Zoe results came back and showed I clear fat slowly. So that all sounds like, well, I clear fat slowly, meaning that too much fat is going to be inflammatory for me. Well, that made a lot of sense based on the way I felt when I did keto. It actually felt inflammatory. All the fat that I was eating felt inflammatory. If I drank a bulletproof coffee, it felt terrible. All that coconut oil, it just felt like, didn't feel good. So I'm like, well, now that makes a lot of sense for me, but I still wasn't ready to hear it. So I just, maybe used a little bit less butter, cut back a little bit. So fast forward to when I went through Zoe the second time, they were offering retests. I wanted to see, they offered one to me. It was before they were officially offering them, but I wanted to see, how had my gut changed over the years? So I wanted to do the retest. So I did the retest and wearing the CGM that time, making the connections and then got my results. And I'm like, I'm going to really try to eat the Zoe way and see. Well, I did notice that my blood sugar was better when I was doing whole food, plant-based, lower-ish fat. So I did that for a little while, but it's challenging. I live in a beach community where it's a lot of tourists are here. And if you want to go out to eat, there's nothing whole food plant-based around here to really, there's nowhere to go. So that was hard. But I was like, well, I felt great. That was a great experiment, but I'm back to eating all the foods. Well, fast forward to August of 2023. My dad is in really poor health, and he's been a type 2 diabetic all of his life. Well, not all of his life, but all of like my adult life. Ever since I've been an adult and known it, he's been a type 2 diabetic, and he hasn't really taken care of his health. So I thought, I need to revisit this whole food plant-based lower fat approach. Because to be honest, when I was doing it before, I wasn't really lower fat. So I went back to it and I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to see how I feel. Well, I felt amazing. At that time, I was not wearing a CGM until about a month into it. But I had worn a CGM in the past when I was going through Zoe. My podcast was sponsored by NutriSense for a while, so I had their CGMs. And, I have a pretty healthy blood sugar response. But I'd been doing whole food plant-based for about a month. And so I popped on a CGM sensor that I had in my closet. This is the first time I'd ever worn a CGM while doing whole food plant-based low fat. I was sauteing in vegetable broth. I wasn't using olive oil. I was fully keeping the fat low. I thought my sensor was broken.
You thought the CGM was broken because there was no glycemic response when you ate?
It was, yes. I mean, I was eating, obviously no food is 100% carbs. Food has, even, plants have a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein, whatever. But I was eating plant foods, I was not adding, olive oil. Because when I had done it before, I was still having the olive oil. I was using the plant butter substitutes, whatever. The dairy substitutes that were, higher in fat. A lot of them have coconut oil in them. But I thought my CGM was miscalibrated. So I said, well, I've got to challenge this. So I had a couple of days where I added in dairy and fat and meat. And there was my normal blood sugar response that I was used to. It was not the CGM. And I'm like, darn it, Cyrus is right.
Yeah, this stuff actually works.
Yeah.
That's actually so good to hear because most of the time, the verbiage in the world of blood glucose regulation, I'm going to call it blood sugar regulation, even though I can't stand the term sugar. But what you'll see if you go onto the internet is that people are misinterpreting what the word spike means, right? So people are like, oh, you want to avoid glucose spikes. You want to avoid blood sugar spikes. And so there's this movement to try and suppress. And the way that you can suppress your mealtime blood glucose is literally by adding fat-rich foods, and that will have a suppressive effect. But you did the opposite. You basically said, no, I'm going to follow the Mastering Diabetes way. I'm going to remove the excess added fat that I normally would be putting on, like the olive oil and the butter and the cheese. And as a result of that, your glucose became significantly more stable to the point where you actually thought your CGM was broken. That's crazy.
Like I know that a soft pretzel is not Mastering Diabetes whole food plant-based, but I go to trivia with friends every Thursday, and we're sitting at the bar having trivia, and the only thing on the menu that is not dairy, meat, egg, it was this soft pretzel. So I'm like, well, I'm going to have this soft pretzel with, here at this trivia night with my friends. And I dipped it in mustard or something. My blood sugar spiked all the way up. Are you ready? To 99.
Oh boy.
That's not a whole food. It's like a pretzel. It's a soft, it's a bread. I had 100% bread. I'm like, there is definitely something wrong with this CGM because I just ate a soft pretzel and my blood sugar didn't even budge. So that was when I did the challenge. But I compared my data going back from when I was wearing the CGM before and just doing intermittent fasting and eating all the foods and seeing, how my blood glucose went up after a meal. And what I noticed is, sure, it might not have gone up very quickly after a meal when I was having all the fat, all the meat, all the everything, all the dairy, but it stayed up. It stayed up. And in the morning when I woke up, my morning blood sugars were much higher when I was having more fat.
Okay, let me get this straight. Let me just back up here. You're saying that you were following that previous methodology that we talked about where you're adding fat to your meals.
I was eating everything. Yep.
Eating everything. And there's a significant amount of, fat-rich foods in those meals or concentrated fat sources. And your glucose response at those meals itself, or for the 2 to 3 hours following that meal, was very well controlled. But then after the delayed 6 to 12 hours after the fact, your glucose would be higher. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it stayed up. So I found that, my blood glucose went up, not crazy, like 125, right? After a meal, even if I had if I went out and had fried shrimp and salad and cake, I mean, not exactly a super healthy meal at but I remember that's one restaurant meal I had specifically. We took friends out to eat. I was wearing a CGM, and that's pretty much what I had: salad, she crab soup, fried shrimp, and we split strawberry cake. And my blood sugar went up to 125 after that. And so I'm like, look, I had cake and my blood sugar only went up to 125. But then it stayed up. And in the morning when I woke up, it was still just over 100. And so that I'm like, well, if you just look at what it did immediately post the meal, you would think that's amazing. But our blood sugar shouldn't be staying up that much for so long. So when I was whole food, plant-based, lower fat, my blood sugar did not spike to 125. It did not go that high. I didn't have huge jumps. It just stayed normal. Like I said, 99 after having the soft pretzel. But I would wake up in the morning and my blood sugar would be in the 80s.
So I'm glad to hear you say this, actually, because what I think most people may not be aware of is that when you try and suppress your blood glucose at mealtime by adding tuna or chicken or peanut butter, which is what you see on social media all over the place. People are saying, I'm going to add fat to this meal and that will give me a better blood glucose response, which is a true statement. But there's this thing called a delayed onset postprandial hyperglycemia, which is just a really complicated way of saying delayed onset at 3 hours, starting at the 3 hour marker after the meal is over. That's when your glucose will begin to rise. And this is backed up by plenty of scientific evidence. And then there's another phenomenon called delayed onset postprandial hyperinsulinemia, which is about 3 hours after you're done eating the meal, your insulin concentrations will also begin to rise. And effectively what's happening under the surface is that because your blood glucose is rising, your pancreas is trying to secrete more insulin in order to bring your blood glucose down. But your pancreas secretes a little bit more insulin and it doesn't have much of an effect. So it secretes a little bit more insulin to bring it down and it doesn't have much of an effect. So effectively in that delayed onset 3 hour beyond your meal timing, that's when both blood glucose and insulin are on the rise. And if you calculate the total amount of insulin that you secrete over the course of the next 12 hours, it can be greater than 65% more than if you were to eat a low-fat meal. So it's a very, very large effect.
Well, and it absolutely, I saw it directly and, with my CGM, and, it's astonishing. It's the opposite of what most people would think. You think, oh, carbs, I'm going to have crazy blood sugars, crazy blood glucose, but actually the fat really does clog up the works, like you said. And, we know that having high levels of insulin all the time is really bad for us. It keeps you from tapping into your fat stores. It's anti-lipolytic. You're in storing mode instead of fat burning mode. So we're really not doing ourselves any favors there.